Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I am Keenya Robertson. I'm the President and CEO of Housing Opportunities Project for Excellence, the Fair Housing Center serving the greater Miami and Fort Lauderdale areas. I also serve as the chair of the board of directors of the National Fair Housing Alliance. Very pleased to be your host for today's presentation. But before I introduce our featured speaker, I have a few housekeeping items. Please be aware that this presentation is being recorded and it will be available on the NFHA website in case you'd like to share it with others or revisit it yourself. All participants are going to remain muted during the session, so we encourage you to use the chat feature. You can introduce yourselves and interact with other participants, but we also want you to submit your questions, which we're going to address, and as many of them as we actually can, at about 3:45 or so at the conclusion of the featured presentation. So with that, I'll get started. An African-American male is killed by a white police officer in the view of others. Angry people take to the streets and protest. There's unrest that goes on night after night. Does that sound familiar? I'm not speaking of the murder of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020 in Minneapolis, but rather July 16th, 1964 in Manhattan's Upper East Side, where an off-duty white officer shot and killed a Black student. His name was James Powell. Hundreds of his classmates took to the streets in protest. Far worse lay ahead. More racial rioting erupted the following summer in Los Angeles' Watts section. In 1966, there was more to come, this time in Cleveland. Then came the disastrous summer of 1967. Chaos enveloped more than 160 American cities and towns. With the nation reeling that summer, President Lyndon B. Johnson created a task force to explore the roots of the unrest and possible remedies. The National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, known as the Kerner Commission, led by Governor Otto Kerner Jr. of Illinois, released the report in February 1968 after 7 months of investigation. I'm going to share with you a little snippet from a video produced by the New York Times specific to that.
The Kerner Commission's conclusions were stark. It pointed to decades of pent-up frustration in Black communities over police brutality, poverty, and the inequality caused by discrimination and segregation. And the Commission placed the blame for those inequalities squarely on white Americans and racism.
Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Discrimination and segregation have long permeated much of American life. They now threaten the future of every American.
The Kerner Report called for sweeping changes to American society, more economic opportunity in Black communities, better housing conditions, and more accountability for the police.
Again, familiarity. Much of this rings true today, or is very familiar today. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. pronounced the report a physician's warning of approaching death with a prescription for life. Our speaker today is Dr. Alan Curtis. He's had a long history of delving into policies affecting racism and poverty. He is the founding president and CEO of the Eisenhower Foundation in Washington, D.C., which is the private section continuation of the Kerner Commission and the Violence Commission. Dr. Curtis, along with Fred Harris, the lone surviving member of the 11-member Kerner Commission, co-edited the book Healing Our Divided Society, Investing in America 50 Years After the Kerner Report. He's here to share with us a re-examination 50 years later of the work still needed toward the goals set forth in the Kerner Report. Dr. Curtis, welcome. I turn things over to you now.
Thank you, Keenya, and I'm so happy for this opportunity to be with you all this afternoon. I really feel very much at home. Our late Senator Edward Brooke sponsored the Fair Housing Act in 1968, and our late trustee Patricia Roberts Harris was Secretary of HUD in 1977 and the first African-American woman to be appointed a cabinet secretary. sounds like we're about to have another African-American woman. I worked with Secretary Harris on America's first national urban policy for President Carter in the 70s, and it was not always easy. At White House meetings, I advocated strategies for the truly disadvantaged that bubbled up from the grassroots, but some of the other federal departments argued for a more top-down supply-side approach. Nonetheless, we all agreed on the urban policies Community Reinvestment Act of 1977. After President Carter's urban policy was developed, Secretary Harris asked me to direct the federal anti-crime program in public housing that was part of the urban policy. And at the press conference where we launched it, Pat Harris introduced Congressman Claude Pepper of Miami. We called him Senator Pepper because he previously had been a senator. Those are some interesting stories on that. He was chair of the House Select Committee on Aging, and we integrated his Public Housing Security Demonstration Act with our urban policy crime prevention. So the secretary and the senator allowed me to co-target funds from HUD, from labor, from justice, from HHS and Interior to public housing agencies across the nation. And I got a chance to meet the senior citizens at Claude Pepper Towers in Miami. So Keenya, that's my trip to Miami back then. One day, on the day that President Carter then lost the 1980 election, I was in another HUD development in Chicago. I was with the resident committee at Robert Taylor Homes, where the elevators were not working and where bullets zinged down the corridors. As a Carter appointee, I had to leave government after the election, but our foundation added the lessons of the Jimmy Carter 70s to our priority on the Lyndon Johnson 60s. In those 60s, as you well know, as Keenya has just showed us, America experienced disturbances in over 150 cities. The establishment called them riots. People of color called them protests. The same kind of different languages being used today. But in response to those 60s protests, President Johnson formed the Kerner Commission, named after Otto Kerner, who was the governor of Illinois. Most of the Kerner members were white men who bore the imprimatur of the political establishment. Yet nonetheless, a majority of the commission members really came out honestly and in a way where they shared common grounds by saying the fundamental problem was white racism and that America was two societies, black and white, separate and unequal. We later updated the Kerner Commission a number of times, and most recently the 50th anniversary update just a short time ago, and we on the foundation concluded that America still has made little progress in reducing racial injustice, inequality, and poverty. With your indulgence this afternoon, what I would like to do is share a little of what we recommended in healing our divided society, our Kerner update, now within the context of the pandemic, the election, and police violence. I'd like to frame the big picture. What have been the major trends since the 60s? Have we the evidence and the will to scale up what we know to work? Can we seize the day now after the election? And what obstacles stand in the way? To begin with, just a little on the trends on racial injustice, inequality, and poverty since the Kerner Commission. America, of course, has elected the first African-American president, now the first woman of color as vice president. There have been dramatic increases in the number of African-American and Latino elected officials, and the African-American and Latino middle classes have dramatically expanded. Yet I would suggest to you that James Baldwin's warning to Robert Kennedy on systemic racism that night in New York City so long ago resonates as powerfully as ever. Neo-Nazis have made their statements and inflicted deaths in Charlottesville, and in so many other places across America. QAnon and white nationalist movements have substantial online presence. Some white Americans speak openly of nostalgia for a time when their dominance could be taken for granted. American public school segregation has increased since the Kerner Commission, beginning with the backward-looking federal policy of the 1980s. Black Lives Matter has revealed what Americans did not want to see in Ferguson, and the movement has matured over the last 7 years into its prominent organizing role now in the national protests against police violence. Zero tolerance, stop and frisk policing against people of color has failed. American sentencing laws remain racially biased. About 200,000 people were in prison at the time of the Kerner Commission in 1968. Today, because of the crime legislation of the 80s and the 90s, there are 2.2 million people in prison, and they are disproportionately people of color. So a tenfold plus increase. Mass incarceration, I think, really has become the present iteration of slavery and Jim Crow. In many ways, mass incarceration also has become part of American housing policy for the poor. That housing policy has included conscious, purposeful government-created segregation, as you all know, and as my friend and colleague Greg Squires has documented so well in his book, The Fight for Fair Housing. I want to thank Greg for his presentations with me around the country on these issues. Income inequality and wealth inequality have dramatically increased since the 68 Kerner Commission. America's richest 1% now hold about as much wealth as the bottom 90%. The real estate wealth gap, as you know, between African Americans and whites continues to grow. The home ownership remains much lower for people of color than for whites. Inequality was greatly accelerated by the supply side created Great Recession of 2008. The speed at which the rich have been pulling away from the rest of America has been breathtaking since the Kerner Commission. And so the narrative today on systemic change needs to be about both race and class. In the last 50 years, most of the economic gains from rising productivity have gone to the wealthiest 1%, to corporate profits, to shareholders, to CEOs, but not to workers. In the 1950s, top American CEOs made about 20 times as much as average workers. Today, they make over 320 times as much. Slaves, of course, were not allowed labor unions, and today much of corporate America has attacked unions, even though a majority of Americans and Poles favor unions. The ratio of African American to white unemployment has remained 2 to 1 over all 50 years since the Kerner Commission. White corporate financiers on Wall Street brought us the Great Recession of 2008, yet they have not been punished. They have not been adjudicated into the prison industrial complex, which is a source of corporate profit. Since the 1968 Kerner Commission, the deep poverty rate has increased, reflecting what the late insightful journalist Molly Ivins accurately called the welfare reform legislation of the 1990s. That legislation has failed based on evaluations by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. The richest country in history continues to produce the highest rate of overall child poverty among all industrialized democracies. The pandemic has made racial injustice, inequality, and poverty much worse. The resulting frustration among people of color and the resulting awareness among at least some white Americans then helped generate the national protests against police violence after George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis. These then are just some of the facts, some of the most significant trends since the Kerner Commission. If we hope to reverse such trends and to heal our dividing society, I suggest we need to base policy on evidence and science, not on conjecture and dogma. Yet today, the few American national, state, and local public sector programs are evidence-based. All that public money and so little policy based on evidence and on what works. When it comes to not following evidence, the most disturbing American examples have been the failed policy against the pandemic and the false claims of 2020 election fraud. In turn, our public health failure has generated our economic crisis, our unemployment crisis, and the stressful debate over in-person versus virtual education. These are not just public sector failures. The very notion of policy based on science and evidence meets resistance from many Americans. We would do well then, I suggest, to use the 2020 election to create a genuine movement for evidence-based policy and decision-making based on science. We would very much appreciate your ideas on how this can be done for housing policy. For now, we can at least identify what has proven to work to reduce racial injustice, inequality, and poverty, and then advocate for scaling it up. Here, since the Kerner Commission's big picture recommendations, we can focus, as they did, on economic, education, and housing priorities. That was about the ranking that the Kerner Commission gave to the most important policy areas. Which means today, to begin with economic policy, it needs to be integrated with public health policy as part of a new stimulus package that is adequately funded. We need to suppress the virus and roll out a vaccine that can achieve full economic recovery. Based on the evidence that recovery means Keynesian demand-side investments in our workers. I speak of investments in human capital, job training and job placement combined with living wages, secure health insurance, and paid medical and family leave. Full employment with upward mobility for workers is especially needed for new jobs repairing the crumbling American infrastructure, new jobs for building low-income housing, new jobs in manufacturing, and new jobs expanding technologies to reverse climate change. As Pulitzer Prize winning author Stephen Pearlstein has reminded us, reducing economic inequality through these and related Keynesian demand-side policies for average workers won't make us poor. The Scandinavian countries, for example, have much lower inequality than America, but per capita income levels that are just about the same. What does evidence-based policy mean in education? Well, preschool works. All 3- and 4-year-olds should receive it. We need racial integration in public schools, much more equitable financing of public schools, significant expansion of public community schools, enhancement of quantum opportunities, youth development type programs, and the elimination of the school to prison pipeline. The state of Connecticut offers an excellent evidence-based model on these kinds of innovations. What does evidence-based policy then mean in housing? The evidence supports creating universal Section 8 vouchers and scaling up proven models of family mobility that break down single-family zoning barriers, as you are so much aware and so much in the lead. Evaluations by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities have shown that as Section 8 vouchers give family access to shelter, they also unsurprisingly increase family housing stability. They lessen domestic violence, and they reduce separation of children from families. So there's the evidence there. For mobility programs, Harvard and Rand Corporation evaluations have shown how children in families receiving federal assistance for moving to better neighborhoods are more likely to attend college and earn higher incomes. Mobility programs in Maryland and Washington State, I believe, have been especially successful. To be sure, universal vouchers and scaled up family mobility need to be accompanied by increases in the supply of low-income housing. For financing, the new Secretary of Housing and Urban Development hopefully will return to partnerships with national social entrepreneurs like LISC and enterprise community partners. What does evidence-based policy mean in criminal justice? Aware of the astronomical cost of racist prison building, states like California, New York, and New Jersey have reduced their prison populations by over 25% over recent years without any real increases in reported crime. We need to accelerate such reductions across all states as we at the same time shut down modern day debtor prisons. What successful place-based programs at work can be co-targeted in specific geographic locations with truly disadvantaged populations? Let me begin with public safety here, because it is so much in the headlines today. The police killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and all the people of color before them finally have generated some more dialogue, some more serious dialogue on the role of police in the community. We need to sustain and enrich that debate that's going on now. For example, instead of what is conventionally called community policing, which can amount to not much more than public relations in some places, our foundation has positively evaluated genuine community police partnerships in very diverse locations, from Puerto Rico to New Hampshire to South Carolina to San Francisco. In such locations, nonprofit community-based organizations, staff, and carefully selected police have worked as equals to mentor youth and to bubble up with residents locally relevant strategies that create safety, reduce crime, and reduce fear in specific place-based locations. One of our demonstrations, the community organization actually taught a course in the police academy. America very much needs dialogue among police chiefs, Black Lives Matter, and indigenous nonprofits, I believe, on scaling up such community police partnerships. I believe the National Fair Housing Alliance can be a catalyst for such dialogue, and we need your help and support. I ask you to identify places, if you can find them, where we could work together on such community police partnerships. The genuine partnerships can be like I'm talking about, can then become a national model for finding common ground across our divided society. With increased resources and good training, local nonprofit organizations also can undertake some of the work presently done by police, dealing, for example, with the homeless, with serving as mental health responders, and mediating disputes. With good planning, genuine community police partnerships can be designed by creative mayors to stabilize neighborhoods and so encourage community-based banking and business development, as was pioneered by the Shore Bank in Chicago. Such community financing can help encourage integrated housing by CDCs like Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn and the New Community Corporation in Newark. The integrated housing, in turn, can help facilitate integrated schools and generate good jobs for both community residents and returning ex-offenders. For ex-offender reintegration, there are a number of excellent evidence-based models that work, like the Minnesota Comprehensive Reentry Plan. In other words, what I'm saying is that place-based and evidence-based policy at the grassroots needs to be holistic. We need to de-silo. Public safety, employment, education, and housing strategies need to be complementary and interdependent. They need not be separate and unequal. There is so much potential, I believe, for place-based multiple solutions like those we began to develop in public housing during the Carter administration. The scaling up of what works needs to be financed in part by the scaling down of what doesn't work. What doesn't work in America is willful indifference to the unequal distribution of prosperity. What doesn't work is the present concentration of wealth. What doesn't work includes supply-side economics and Milton Friedman. What doesn't work includes enterprise and opportunity zones. What doesn't work includes global symposia in Davos and in Silicon Valley, boardrooms where so-called thought leaders talk down to us. Avoid how to reduce inequality. Avoid how to change fundamental power equations, and avoid how to reform the rules of the game. Instead, the fashion has been to recite corporate public relation buzzwords like market-driven solutions and social impact investing. What doesn't work includes abuse of the phrase systemic change. Systemic change does not mean a week of diversity training, corporate tokenism, lots of new t-shirts, and ball game television ads trying to co-opt Black Lives Matter. Systemic change means, for example, strict enforcement of the Fair Housing Act, school and housing integration, full employment at living wages, secure health insurance for everyone, more power to unions, enforcement of antitrust laws, equity in public school financing, preschool for all children, greater equality in new community police partnerships, and reduced prison populations. Most of all, what doesn't work includes false 1980s rhetoric on government being the problem. Well, the federal government was, in fact, the problem during the 1980s. In that decade, inequality rose sharply. Wages for average Americans stagnated. Labor union power was reduced. Poverty increased. Homelessness increased. Mass incarceration of people of color rose dramatically. Regulation was weakened, and giant corporations began to monopolize industry after industry. In fact, then, much of the problem in the 1980s was dishonest government, corporate greed, and absence of responsibility. Today, the solution includes good government, regulation of greed, well-managed place-based policy, and a larger role for indigenous, nonprofit, community-based organizations. Progress in addressing these healing goals doubles as a potentially significant international strategy for America. Authoritarian regimes have routinely and easily deflected our criticisms, pointing to America's own human and civil rights abuses. That is what China's propaganda bureaucracies have been doing with American street protests against police violence. But if the United States can finally make progress on healing and Kerner priorities, the result can be new soft power in dealing with China, Russia, and other dictatorships. Enhanced soft power can increase international confidence in America and help repair our international alliances and traditional partners. So there are links between domestic and international policy in this framework. Yet, new American soft power and new evidence-based policy cannot emerge, I suggest, without the new will, quote unquote, that the original Kerner Commission said was essential for progress in America. Just think about it. What is the use of evidence in our threatened democracy if there is no will to take action? More than 50 years after the Kerner Commission, the creation of new will may be harder to achieve than ever. That is why we need to remember Robert Kennedy quoting George Bernard Shaw. Some see things as they are and ask why. We must dream of things that never were and ask why not. In that devastating year of 1968, Dr. King asked why not. As he endorsed the Kerner Commission, MLK was advocating a multiracial coalition for economic justice among the poor, the working class, and the middle class. And then he was assassinated while protesting nonviolently with sanitation workers in Memphis. Just think of the audacity of what Dr. King was saying in 1968. In terms of the narrative today, he was advocating that poor whites in West Virginia need to align with poor African Americans in Chicago, with the oppressed people of Puerto Rico, with the homeless Latinx populations of Los Angeles, and with impoverished Native Americans in New Mexico. He wanted economic justice that made sense to different faiths and to urban, small town, and rural America. He wanted middle-class people on the coasts, as well as in the Midwest, to join workers and the poor in economic justice. The creation of the King Economic Justice Coalition, which embraced and moved beyond the civil rights movement, needs to be one point of departure for the generation of new will in the 21st century. Not easy, but we must try and we must be creative. Side by side with Black Lives Matter, the way is being led by people like MacArthur Foundation Genius Award winner Bishop William Barber and his continuation of Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign against the immorality of poverty and inequality. Intentionally, Black Lives Matter is a leaderful movement. It leads from the grassroots by allowing victims, survivors, and people with personal experience to speak. We need more of that. Now, history has shown that successful movements in America are inclusive and opportunistic. Successful movements build constituencies that cross-endorse one another in ways that mutually strengthen alliances. Some alliances have, in fact, been strengthened in 2020, for example, through the predominantly peaceful protests against police violence and through the immensely successful registration of voters. We now need to further strengthen alliances and integrate in more constituencies. The constituencies need to complement Black Lives Matter and Reverend Barber. What are just a few examples of the constituencies needed? Well, those current constituencies ought to include, I believe, many of the 99% of Americans who have suffered the inequality, greed, and malfeasance of Wall Street. Those current constituencies ought to include the 17 million poor white Americans who live in poverty and who need to be reunited with poor people of color. Those healing constituencies include the Fair Housing Advocacy Network. Those healing constituencies include re-empowered organized labor to advocate for employment and education policies that unite workers of all races. Those healing constituencies include millennials who have been participating in greater numbers, and I have high hopes for our daughter and her Generation Z. Those healing constituencies include reformers like Boston University professor Ibram Kendi, who advocates continuing anti-racism training, beginning in preschool and leading to self-aware anti-racist practices throughout people's daily lives. To Dr. Kendi, silence is complicity. To Dr. Kendi, indifference is collusion. The healing constituencies we need include the leaders of newly emerging local initiatives trying to integrate urban schools that remain profoundly segregated, beginning in New York City. The healing constituencies include high school students from Parkland, Florida, who have led the Never Again movement against firearms violence and who have begun to partner with Everytown for Gun Safety, Sandy Hook, Promise, and the Giffords Center against the American addiction to guns. The healing constituencies, lastly, include citizens who, like the members of the original Kerner Commission, will not give up on trying to find at least some common ground. For example, we need to explore for common ground on how diversity and patriotism are both woven into the American fabric, on how both high school graduates and college graduates can be respectful of one another, and how the lives of both working class people of color and working class whites can be advanced, and how police can both serve the people and ensure their safety, and on how we can both reduce inequality and create economic growth. How much time should nonprofit advocates spend on finding such common ground? The time it takes costs scarce nonprofit dollars. To what extent is finding common ground compromising an organization's principles? To what extent is it wiser to stick to an organization's ideals and wait for circumstances that allow them to be realized? As we all struggle with such issues, we need, I suggest, to reject calls for returning back to normal in the post-pandemic world. Normal is the problem in America. Now the election, the pandemic, and the protests against police violence offer an opportunity to redefine normal, seize the day, rewrite the rules, reframe the public discourse, and renegotiate the social contract. Crucially, the generation of new will needs to be facilitated by the creation of a fair, more responsive American democracy. Now, granted, democracy worked in 2020. Decentralized by state, vote counting was efficient. Thanks to advocacy by nonprofit organizations, there was transparency. The court system upheld the vote. Protected by the First Amendment, at least some media sorted out what was true and what was false. Yet there is so much more democracy work ahead of us. If the votes of all Americans were actually given equal weight, a new MLK economic justice movement will have a better chance. That is why we must intensify advocacy for John Lewis voting rights reform. We must intensify advocacy for campaign finance reform. We must intensify advocacy against gerrymandering, and we must intensify advocacy to abolish the Electoral College. We need to remember Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's powerful dissents on behalf of democracy and resist those who try to lock in minority rule. Equally important, the generation of new will needs to be facilitated by reform of the media, which the original Kerner Commission criticized as much as the police. For example, in addition to hiring more people of color and to including much more coverage of what works, the media needs to be reminded that the real story is, in fact, dog bites man. That is, the real story is grinding, continuing, everyday, systemic racism, inequality, and poverty. We must, as well, take regulatory action against Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms that push addicted users deeper and deeper into their own bubbles, intensifying division and hatred. Social media make it so easy to insult people without having to look them in the eye and acknowledge their humanity. Unless social media companies are made to care more about facts, their sites will continue to prevent healing. To be sure, a new economic justice alliance and new will need to emerge in America at the grassroots outside of government. But new legislation and new funding must build on good government at the local, state, and federal levels. Some advocate for what is called the new localism, and we must encourage de-siloed place-based solutions centered on creative nonprofit organizations finding common ground with City Hall. Yet Americans cannot, I suggest, give up on good federal government. We have, in fact, already reversed that false 1980s rhetoric on diminishing federal government. 2020 has hosted the largest expansion of federal financial history in activity in American history. We now need to seize the day for the kind of bold, activist government America experienced when we busted the trusts, when we created Social Security, and when we passed the Civil Rights Act, and when President Kennedy asked citizens what they could do for their country. We need to recognize the recent Pew survey, which found almost 60% of Americans think government should do more to solve problems, quote unquote. Yet how much more can we really do at this moment in our history? The big picture healing question today is this: will the federal government be able to suppress the pandemic, create full employment with good jobs, deal with climate change, improve the functioning of our democracy, at the same time we reduce systemic racism, inequality, and poverty? That, my friends, is a very, very tall order, to say the least. Based on the results of the election, and as America faces a potentially cruel pandemic winter, what is the realistic outlook now for activist federal government to heal our divided society? Our ability depends in part on the January Senate runoff election in Georgia. If the Georgia runoff election results in unified party control in Washington, new federal healing legislation is possible, though it still would not be easy to enact. It would not be easy to enact because of the Senate filibuster, which historically has been a powerful instrument of systemic racism. But there are procedural ways to get around the filibuster, even though they are costly. Within a framework of possible legislation, though, the first priority is funding to suppress the pandemic and to produce and distribute the vaccine. As I have noted, such legislation needs to be combined with a new infusion of economic stimulus funding for families, for businesses, for nonprofit organizations, for state governments and local governments, to avoid financial ruin and foreclosures before the vaccine arrives. From the perspective of healing our divided society, a public health and economic legislative priority makes sense because people of color and the poor have suffered disproportionately from the pandemic. Other possibly feasible legislation, just possible, that is relevant to healing and Kerner priorities might include criminal justice reform in many areas, expanded preschool, as I have suggested, and job generating infrastructure repair. Any such legislation might well need to be passed in the window of opportunity before the 2022 congressional elections. Right now, I'm not sure whether legislation might be possible to create universal housing vouchers, scale up proven family mobility programs, and expand the supply of housing with partners like Liz and Enterprise. There has been at least some bipartisan support in the House this year, for example, for the Yes in My Backyard Act. If, however, the January Georgia Senate runoff elections result in separate party control of the House and the Senate, then the odds of passing healing and Kerner relevant legislation diminish. Here, the best hope for progress, of course, will be presidential executive orders that don't require congressional approval. Just a few executive orders relevant to housing, Kerner, and healing include reinstatement of the 2015 affirmatively furthering fair housing rule, reinstatement of the 2013 HUD disparate impact rule, rescission of the executive order prohibiting anti-racism training like that practiced by Professor Kendi, re-emphasis on federal consent decrees on police departments, creation of a racial and ethnic disparities task force, and establishment of a $15 minimum wage for employees of federal contractors. The executive branch needs as well to restore the morale of federal employees, create a commission on evidence-based policy, bring more science-based and evidence-based employees back into government, and reduce the neglect of federal infrastructure over recent years. If then seizing the day and making progress on all fronts is daunting today, our role as nonprofits advocating, organizing, and mobilizing remains fundamental to healing America's future. Our blood, toil, tears, and sweat are intergenerational, whether the promised land takes us 10 years or 50 years or 100 years. So I challenge you all to create new and more powerful models of alliance building. We challenge you to help organize more virtual events on healing our divided society. We really would like to hear from you and are sending you copies of this presentation. We challenge you to communicate to privileged Americans and to the corporate world how negative the trends have been since the 1960s. And we challenge you, most importantly, to generate new will among the citizenry. Finally, we challenge you to never forget how long the dream has been deferred. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Perhaps that dream just sags like a heavy load. Or, my friends, does it just explode? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Curtis, for giving us constructive measures for how we can really address racial inequalities in this nation. The audience you have today includes some of the very people who can make some of this happen. Got a couple questions in the chat, and I'm going to start with one from Alyssa Newsom. Dr. Curtis, how do you feel about more radical policy proposals like defunding the police? Reform has produced unsatisfying results and often results in more funding being provided to police departments and away from other social agencies in municipalities.
Well, as I have said, there are areas where we can provide alternative ways of helping those who are homeless, people who have mental illness, and there are alternative ways of resolving disputes on the street. These are all modes that can be undertaken by indigenous community-based organizations with proper training. So we endorse that. But we also say that the police are not going to go away, and we need to seriously focus on what community policing really means. And so many police departments talk about community policing, but it's not much more than public relations. Yet some police departments have really worked with us so that we have, for example, civilians working hand in hand with police to mentor youth. And we have police who are specially trained in police academies by community organizations working to plan out with folks in the community ways that they mutually agree on to reduce crime, reduce fear, and increase trust. This can be done. So this is a really important Black Lives Matter issue, obviously. And I think the more debate we have, the better. We would very much like, for example, to have a forum where we could bring Black Lives Matter and progressive police chiefs together to discuss this. And I might say this also, I presented on these issues to NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. And it was a great meeting. It was in 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning in New Orleans. And so I thought, oh, no one's going to show up after Saturday night in New Orleans. But everyone showed up, and they were standing room only. And there was so much enthusiasm among the African-American police chiefs on trying to innovate in ways that bring the community and police together. So we are attempting to pursue that with NOBLE, and now we're saying a lot of this work with police is so relevant to public housing movements in different ways. And so if you can, everyone in the audience can think about the cities and police chiefs and mayors where we might actually do some demonstration programs, we would be most indebted to you.
Thank you. So Ken Walden asks, in the spirit of devil's advocacy, how do you reconcile your proposals with the fact that quite a few Americans supported and will continue to support Trump, and with the booming national debt?
Well, you're not asking easy questions, that's for sure. So I tried to be a bit balanced when I talked about finding common ground. We will try to find common ground. I just illustrated it with the police. But I think we also simply have to realize that some people are not going to be changed. And we need to try, and we need to keep on working. But we have to be sober and realistic about how many people can change. We're going to actually go to corporations and try to have this discussion with them, and it may not be easy. And I've made presentations to Ivy League university alumni, attempting to get them to criticize me and see if we can find common ground together. I don't have an easy answer for this, but what we are doing at our foundation is finding some balance, trying to find common ground, but sticking to our principles and our ideals, and not giving up on the struggle.
Perhaps Yolanda Kendricks has an easier question for you, Dr. Curtis. She'd like to know if you consider making yourself available for a public office again in Washington, D.C. to apply your wealth of information regarding social injustice policies and systemic racism that includes scientific evidence.
Well, we're open to working in the private and the public sectors, and we have to see what now emerges. That there are people in the new administration with whom we're in touch, but I can't underestimate how we in the nonprofit sector have a really important role to play in pushing for, as far as we can. We need to seize the day. How far can we go in doing that under the present political circumstances? That's the question I think we all have to face.
I have a couple of email questions really quickly before we wrap up. We just have a couple minutes left. If you could tell the Biden-Harris administration only 3 things it should do related to racial equity, what would those 3 things be?
3 things related to racial equity. Well, I would focus on the economic, the education, and the criminal justice for now. I'm assuming we'll all get vaccinated by next year at this time, but I'm following the Kerner Commission in terms of economic and education, and I laid out what we need. We need a policy that really invests in human beings. We need something other than trickle down tax breaks to the rich. We need to bubble up job training and real equality in the opportunity to get jobs that are repairing the infrastructure and pursuing climate change. In education, it's the same. It's the same thing. There are obvious ways to deal with systemic racism. For example, if we had equity in school financing, if the number of dollars invested in each public school student across the country were the same in every school, as in, for example, Japan and Korea, we would make progress in dealing with systemic racism and education reform. And then the criminal justice need is clear. We have to reverse the military prison industrial complex. We have to get people out of prisons, and we've got to have this not only this serious dialogue on police, but we need to take action, and that's going to take a long time, and it's going to need real dedication, again, by people in the nonprofit sector, to keep these realities in the public limelight, so that they just don't fade away as some of the reforms of the 60s faded away after the assassinations of Dr. King and Senator Kennedy.
So let's wrap up and conclude on action. What specifically can our fair housing organizations, this fair housing movement, do to implement some of the evidence-based strategies for addressing racial inequalities? What do you feel those of us who are out here focused on fair housing can do?
Well, I mentioned some of the executive orders. You know those better than I do, and they're really essential. But to actually continue to pressure for Section 8 vouchers for all who qualify, to actually recognize again and again how there are so many great mobility programs that have worked, and to work and fight and negotiate for scaling them up, at the same time to make clear that we need more funding for housing, and that we need to return to the system of the 70s, where the federal government partnered with the likes of LISC and Enterprise to supply that housing. I think those three areas of legislation, the Section 8, the mobility, and the production of housing, are clearly the priorities, or among the priorities within the fair housing movement.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Curtis. We're out of time for today, actually, but sharing this valuable information with the audience is just priceless. These are folks who really care about what the information you share means to our communities and how we can make a difference. And my thanks to the audience for being with us today and for your ongoing commitment to fair housing and to simply making this world better for all of us. Before we go, let me tell you the book, Healing Our Divided Society, is available on Amazon. And I saw your question, Marie Flannery, and I think this book may very well address your question regarding updates and talking about what else we can do. It does examine the 50 years that passed since the report. Also want to just shine a light on another NAPA-sponsored book, and that's The Fight for Fair Housing, Causes, Consequences, and Future Implications of the 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act. It was edited by our good friend, Greg Squires, who's joined us today for this meeting. On behalf of the staff and the board of directors of the National Fair Housing Alliance, happy holidays to you all. We look forward to when we can be together again in person next year. Stay safe and blessings, everyone.
Thank you.